Okay, hi boys and girls, this is video 8. You know that today in class we took some time to introduce the Scarlet Ibis by James Hurst, and we took a look at all of the great imagery, the author's use of really the senses, and then also symbolism in the class today. The symbolism of the ibis and the bleeding tree, those will be very important later on in the story. And also just even the grinding wheel, that turn to turn back time. We are right here in your text, which is basically the break in the paragraphs here. And we know that Doodle is born, and he is going to be all there. So without further ado, I'm going to take you into the audio text. If you choose to read the book by yourself, you have your textbook at home, you're welcome to skip through. I'm going to hide again my face during the reading of the audio text. I'll just be scrolling down. But if you choose to read through on your own, just skip to the end of this video where my face comes back up, because there are a couple key points that I want you to know for class tomorrow. So thank you for watching the video, and we'll see you then.
When he was 2, if you laid him on his stomach, he began to try to move himself, straining terribly. The doctor said that with his weak heart, this strain would probably kill him, but it didn't. Trembling, he'd push himself up, turning first red, then a soft purple, and finally collapse back onto the bed like an old, worn-out doll. I can still see Mama watching him, her hand pressed tight across her mouth, her eyes wide and unblinking. But he learned to crawl. It was his 3rd winter, and we brought him out of the front bedroom, putting him on the rug before the fireplace. For the first time, he became one of us. As long as he lay all the time in bed, we called him William Armstrong, even though it was formal and sounded as if we were referring to one of our ancestors. But with his creeping around on the deerskin rug and beginning to talk, something had to be done about his name. It was I who renamed him. When he crawled backward, as if he were in reverse and couldn't change gears. If you called him, he'd turn around as if he were going in the other direction. Then he'd back right up to you to be picked up. Crawling backward made him look like a doodle bug, so I began to call him Doodle. And in time, even Mama and Daddy thought it was a better name than William Armstrong. Only Aunt Nicey disagreed. She said call babies should be treated with special respect, since they might turn out to be saints. Renaming my brother was perhaps the kindest thing I ever did for him, because nobody expects much from someone called Doodle. Although Doodle learned to crawl, he showed no signs of walking, but he wasn't idle. He talked so much that we all quit listening to what he said. It was about this time that Daddy built him a go-kart, and I had to pull him around. At first, I just paraded him up and down the piazza, but then he started crying to be taken out into the yard, and it ended up by my having to lug him wherever I went. If I so much as picked up my cap, he'd start crying to go with me, and Mama would call from wherever she was, "Take Doodle with you." He was a burden in many ways. The doctor had said that he mustn't get too excited, too hot, too cold, or too tired, and that he must always be treated gently. A long list of don'ts went with him, all of which I ignored once we got out of the house. To discourage his coming with me, I'd run with him across the ends of the cotton rows and careen him around corners on 2 wheels. Sometimes I accidentally turned him over, but he never told Mama. His skin was very sensitive, and he had to wear a big straw hat whenever he went out. When the going got rough and he had to cling to the sides of the go-kart, the hat slipped all the way down over his ears. He was a sight. Finally, I could see I was licked. Doodle was my brother, and he was going to cling to me forever, no matter what I did, so I dragged him across the burning cotton field to share with him the only beauty I knew, Old Woman's Swamp. I pulled the go-kart through the sawtooth fern, down into the green dimness where the palmetto fronds whispered by the stream. I lifted him out and set him down in the soft rubber grass beside a tall pine. His eyes were round with wonder as he gazed about him, and his little hands began to stroke the rubber grass. Then he began to cry. "For heaven's sake, what's the matter?" I asked, annoyed. "It's so pretty," he said. "So pretty, pretty, pretty." After that day, Doodle and I often went down into Old Woman's Swamp. I would gather wildflowers, wild violets, honeysuckle, yellow jasmine, snake flowers, and water lilies, and with wire grass, we'd weave them into necklaces and crowns. We'd bedeck ourselves with our handiwork and loll about, thus beautified, beyond the touch of the everyday world. Then, when the slanted rays of the sun burned orange in the tops of the pines, we'd drop our jewels into the stream and watch them float away toward the sea. There is within me, and with sadness I have watched it in others, a knot of cruelty borne by the stream of love, much as our blood sometimes bears the seed of our destruction, and at times I was mean to Doodle. One day, I took him up to the barn loft and showed him his casket, telling him how we all had believed he would die. It was covered with a film of Paris green sprinkled to kill the rats, and screech owls had built a nest inside it. Doodle studied the mahogany box for a long time, then said, "It's not mine." "It is," I said, "and before I'll help you down from the loft, you're going to have to touch it." "I won't touch it," he said sullenly. "Then I'll leave you here by yourself," I threatened, and made as if I were going down. Doodle was frightened of being left. "Don't go leave me, brother," he cried, and he leaned toward the coffin. His hand, trembling, reached out, and when he touched the casket, he screamed. A screech owl flapped out of the box into our faces, scaring us and covering us with Paris green. Doodle was paralyzed, so I put him on my shoulder and carried him down the ladder. And even when we were outside in the bright sunshine, he clung to me, crying, "Don't leave me, don't leave me." When Doodle was 5 years old, I was embarrassed at having a brother of that age who couldn't walk, so I set out to teach him. We were down in Old Woman's Swamp, and it was spring, and the sick, sweet smell of bay flowers hung everywhere like a mournful song. "I'm going to teach you to walk, Doodle," I said. He was sitting comfortably on the soft grass, leaning back against the pine. "Why?" he asked. I hadn't expected such an answer. "So I won't have to haul you around all the time." "I can't walk, brother," he said. "Who says so?" I demanded. "Mama, the doctor, everybody." "Oh, you can walk," I said, and I took him by the arms and stood him up. He collapsed onto the grass like a half-empty flour sack. It was as if he had no bones in his little legs. "Don't hurt me, brother," he warned. "Shut up. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to teach you to walk." I heaved him up again, and again he collapsed. This time he did not lift his face up out of the rubber grass. "I just can't do it. Let's make honeysuckle wreaths." "Oh, yes, you can, Doodle," I said. "All you got to do is try. Now come on." And I hauled him up once more. It seemed so hopeless from the beginning that it's a miracle I didn't give up. But all of us must have something or someone to be proud of, and Doodle had become mine. I did not know then that pride is a wonderful, terrible thing, a seed that bears two vines, life and death. Every day that summer, we went to the pine beside the stream of Old Woman's Swamp, and I put him on his feet at least 100 times each afternoon. Occasionally, I too became discouraged because it didn't seem as if he was trying, and I would say, "Doodle, don't you want to learn to walk?" He'd nod his head, and I'd say, "Well, if you don't keep trying, you'll never learn." Then I'd paint for him a picture of us as old men, white-haired, him with a long white beard, and me still pulling him around in the go-kart. This never failed to make him try again. Finally, one day, after many weeks of practicing, he stood alone for a few seconds. When he fell, I grabbed him in my arms and hugged him, our laughter pealing through the swamp like a ringing bell. Now we knew it could be done. Hope no longer hid in the dark palmetto thicket, but perched like a cardinal in the lacy toothbrush tree, brilliantly visible. "Yes, yes," I cried, and he cried it too. And the grass beneath us was soft, and the smell of the swamp was sweet. With success so imminent, we decided not to tell anyone until he could actually walk. Each day, barring rain, we sneaked into Old Woman's Swamp, and by cotton picking time, Doodle was ready to show what he could do. He still wasn't able to walk far, but we could wait no longer. Keeping a nice secret is very hard to do, like holding your breath. We chose to reveal all on October 8th, Doodle's 6th birthday, and for weeks ahead we mooned around the house, promising everybody a most spectacular surprise. Aunt Nicey said that after so much talk, if we produced anything less tremendous than the resurrection, she was going to be disappointed. At breakfast on our chosen day, when Mama, Daddy, and Aunt Nicey were in the dining room, I brought Doodle to the door in the go-kart just as usual and had them turn their backs, making them cross their hearts and hope to die if they peeked. I helped Doodle up, and when he was standing alone, I let them look. There wasn't a sound as Doodle walked slowly across the room and sat down at his place at the table. Then Mama began to cry and ran over to him, hugging him and kissing him. Daddy hugged him too, so I went to Aunt Nicey, who was thanks praying in the doorway, and began to waltz her around. We danced together quite well until she came down on my big toe with her brogans, hurting me so badly I thought I was crippled for life. Doodle told them it was I who had taught him to walk, so everyone wanted to hug me and I began to cry. "What are you crying for?" asked Daddy, but I couldn't answer. They did not know that I did it for myself, that pride, whose slave I was, spoke to me louder than all their voices, and that Doodle walked only because I was ashamed of having a crippled brother. Within a few months, Doodle had learned to walk well, and his go-kart was put up in the barn loft. It's still there, beside his little mahogany coffin. Now, when we roamed off together, resting often, we never turned back until our destination had been reached, and to help pass the time, we took up lying. From the beginning, Doodle was a terrible liar, and he got me in the habit. Had anyone stopped to listen to us, we would have been sent off to Dick's Hill. My lies were scary, involved, and usually pointless, but Doodle's were twice as crazy. People in his stories all had wings and flew wherever they wanted to go. His favorite lie was about a boy named Peter who had a pet peacock with a 10-foot tail. Peter wore a golden robe that glittered so brightly that when he walked through the sunflowers, they turned away from the sun to face him. When Peter was ready to go to sleep, the peacock spread his magnificent tail, enfolding the boy gently like a closing go-to-sleep flower, burying him in the gloriously iridescent, rustling vortex. Yes, I must admit it. Doodle could beat me lying. Doodle and I spent lots of time thinking about our future. We decided that when we were grown, we'd live in Old Woman's Swamp and pick dog's tongue for a living. Beside the stream, he planned, we'd build us a house of whispering leaves, and the swamp birds would be our chickens. All day long, when we weren't gathering dog's tongue, we'd swing through the cypresses on the rope vines, and if it rained, we'd huddle beneath an umbrella tree and play stick frog. Mama and Daddy could come and live with us if they wanted to. He even came up with the idea that he could marry Mama and I could marry Daddy. Of course, I was old enough to know this wouldn't work out, but the picture he painted was so beautiful and serene that all I could do was whisper yes, yes. Once I had succeeded in teaching Doodle to walk, I began to believe in my own infallibility, and I prepared a terrific development program for him, unknown to Mama and Daddy, of course. I would teach him to run, to swim, to climb trees, and to fight. He too now believed in my infallibility, so we set the deadline for these accomplishments less than a year away when, it had been decided, Doodle could start to school. That winter we didn't make much progress, for I was in school and Doodle suffered from one bad cold after another. But when spring came, rich and warm, we raised our sights again. Success lay at the end of summer like a pot of gold, and our campaign got off to a good start. On hot days, Doodle and I went down to Horsehead Landing, and I gave him swimming lessons or showed him how to row a boat. Sometimes we descended into the cool greenness of Old Woman's Swamp and climbed the rope vines or boxed scientifically beneath the pine where he had learned to walk. Promise hung about us like leaves, and wherever we looked, ferns unfurled and birds broke into song. That summer, the summer of 1918, was blighted. In May and June there was no rain, and the crops withered, curled up, then died under the thirsty sun. One morning in July, a hurricane came out of the east, tipping over the oaks in the yard and splitting the limbs of the elm trees. That afternoon, it roared back out of the west, blew the fallen oaks around, snapping their roots and tearing them out of the earth like a hawk at the entrails of a chicken. Cotton bolls were wrenched from the stalks and lay like green walnuts in the valleys between the rows, while the cornfield leaned over uniformly so that the tassels touched the ground. Doodle and I followed Daddy out into the cotton field, where he stood, shoulders sagging, surveying the ruin. When his chin sank down onto his chest, we were frightened, and Doodle slipped his hand into mine. Suddenly, Daddy straightened his shoulders, raised a giant, knuckly fist, and with a voice that seemed to rumble out of the earth itself, began cursing heaven, hell, the weather, and the Republican Party. Doodle and I, prodding each other and giggling, went back to the house, knowing that everything would be all right. And during that summer, strange names were heard through the house. Chateau Thierry, Amiens, Soissons, and in her blessing at the supper table, Mama once said, "And bless the Pearsons, whose boy Joe was lost in Below Wood." So we came to that clove of seasons. School was only a few weeks away, and Doodle was far behind schedule. He could barely clear the ground when climbing up the rope vines, and his swimming was certainly not passable. We decided to double our efforts to make that last drive and reach our pot of gold. I made him swim until he turned blue and row until he couldn't lift an oar. Wherever we went, I purposely walked fast, and although he kept up, his face turned red and his eyes became glazed. Once, he could go no further, so he collapsed on the ground and began to cry. "Oh, come on, Doodle," I urged. "You can do it. Do you want to be different from everybody else when you start school?" "Does it make any difference?" "It certainly does," I said. "Now come on," and I helped him up. As we slipped through the dog days, Doodle began to look feverish, and Mama felt his forehead, asking him if he felt ill. At night, he didn't sleep well, and sometimes he had nightmares, crying out until I touched him and said, "Wake up, Doodle, wake up." It was Saturday noon, just a few days before school was to start. I should have already admitted defeat, but my pride wouldn't let me. The excitement of our program had now been gone for weeks, but still we kept on with a tired doggedness. It was too late to turn back, for we had both wandered too far into a net of expectations and had left no crumbs behind. Daddy, Mama, Doodle, and I were seated at the dining room table having lunch. It was a hot day, with all the windows and doors open in case a breeze should come. In the kitchen, Aunt Nicey was humming softly. After a long silence, Daddy spoke. "It's so calm, I wouldn't be surprised if we had a storm this afternoon." "I haven't heard a rain frog," said Mama, who believed in signs, as she served the bread around the table. "I did," declared Doodle, "down in the swamp." "He didn't," I said contrarily. "You did, eh?" said Daddy, ignoring my denial. "I certainly did," Doodle reiterated, scowling at me over the top of his iced tea glass, and we were quiet again. Suddenly, from out in the yard came a strange croaking noise. Doodle stopped eating, with a piece of bread poised ready for his mouth. His eyes popped round like two blue buttons. "What's that?" he whispered. I jumped up, knocking over my chair, and had reached the door when Mama called, "Pick up the chair, sit down again, and say excuse me." By the time I had done this, Doodle had excused himself and had slipped out into the yard. He was looking up into the bleeding tree. "It's a great big red bird," he called. The bird croaked loudly again, and Mama and Daddy came out into the yard. We shaded our eyes with our hands against the hazy glare of the sun and peered up through the still leaves. On the topmost branch, a bird the size of a chicken, with scarlet feathers and long legs, was perched precariously. Its wings hung down loosely, and as we watched, a feather dropped away and floated slowly down through the green leaves. "It's not even frightened of us," Mama said. "It looks tired," Daddy added, "or maybe sick." Doodle's hands were clasped at his throat, and I had never seen him stand still so long. "What is it?" he asked. Daddy shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe it's—" At that moment, the bird began to flutter, but the wings were uncoordinated, and amid much flapping and a spray of flying feathers, it tumbled down, bumping through the limbs of the bleeding tree and landing at our feet with a thud. Its long, graceful neck jerked twice into an S, then straightened out, and the bird was still. A white veil came over the eyes, and the long white beak unhinged. Its legs were crossed, and its claw-like feet were delicately curved at rest. Even death did not mar its grace, for it lay on the earth like a broken vase of red flowers, and we stood around it, awed by its exotic beauty. "It's dead," Mama said. "What is it?" Doodle repeated. "Go bring me the bird book," said Daddy. I ran into the house and brought back the bird book. As we watched, Daddy thumbed through its pages. "It's a scarlet ibis," he said, pointing to a picture. "It lives in the tropics, South America to Florida. A storm must have brought it here." Sadly, we all looked back at the bird. A scarlet ibis. How many miles it had traveled to die like this, in our yard, beneath the bleeding tree. "Let's finish lunch," Mama said, nudging us back toward the dining room. "I'm not hungry," said Doodle, and he knelt down beside the ibis. "We've got peach cobbler for dessert," Mama tempted from the doorway. Doodle remained kneeling. "I'm going to bury him." "Don't you dare touch him," Mama warned. "There's no telling what disease he might have had." "All right," said Doodle. "I won't." Daddy, Mama, and I went back to the dining room table, but we watched Doodle through the open door. He took out a piece of string from his pocket and, without touching the ibis, looped one end around its neck. Slowly, while singing softly, "Shall We Gather at the River," he carried the bird around to the front yard and dug a hole in the flower garden next to the petunia bed. Now we were watching him through the front window, but he didn't know it. His awkwardness at digging the hole with a shovel whose handle was twice as long as he was made us laugh, and we covered our mouths with our hands so he wouldn't hear. When Doodle came into the dining room, he found us seriously eating our cobbler. He was pale and lingered just inside the screen door. "Did you get the scarlet ibis buried?" asked Daddy. Doodle didn't speak but nodded his head. "Go wash your hands and then you can have some peach cobbler," said Mama. "I'm not hungry," he said. "Dead birds is bad luck," said Aunt Nicey, poking her head from the kitchen door. "Especially red dead birds." As soon as I had finished eating, Doodle and I hurried off to Horsehead Landing. Time was short, and Doodle still had a long way to go if he was going to keep up with the other boys when he started school. The sun, gilded with the yellow cast of autumn, still burned fiercely, but the dark green woods through which we passed were shady and cool. When we reached the landing, Doodle said he was too tired to swim, so we got into a skiff and floated down the creek with the tide. Far off in the marsh, a rail was scolding, and over on the beach, locusts were singing in the myrtle trees. Doodle did not speak and kept his head turned away, letting one hand trail limply in the water. After we had drifted a long way, I put the oars in place and made Doodle row back against the tide. Black clouds began to gather in the southwest, and he kept watching them, trying to pull the oars a little faster. When we reached Horsehead Landing, lightning was playing across half the sky and thunder roared out, hiding even the sound of the sea. The sun disappeared and darkness descended almost like night. Flocks of marsh crows flew by, heading inland to their roosting trees, and 2 egrets, squawking, arose from the oyster rock shallows and careened away. Doodle was both tired and frightened, and when he stepped from the skiff, he collapsed onto the mud, sending an armada of fiddler crabs rustling off into the marsh grass. I helped him up, and as he wiped the mud off his trousers, he smiled at me ashamedly. He had failed, and we both knew it. So we started back home, racing the storm. We never spoke. What are the words that can solder cracked pride? But I knew he was watching me, watching for a sign of mercy. The lightning was near now, and from fear, he walked so close behind me he kept stepping on my heels. The faster I walked, the faster he walked, so I began to run. The rain was coming, roaring through the pines, and then, like a bursting Roman candle, a gum tree ahead of us was shattered by a bolt of lightning. When the deafening peal of thunder had died, and in the moment before the rain arrived, I heard Doodle, who had fallen behind, cry out, "Brother, brother, don't leave me, don't leave me." The knowledge that Doodle's and my plans had come to naught was bitter, and that streak of cruelty within me awakened. I ran as fast as I could, leaving him far behind with a wall of rain dividing us. The drops stung my face like nettles, and the wind flared the wet, glistening leaves of the bordering trees. Soon I could hear his voice no more. I hadn't run too far before I became tired, and the flood of childish spite evanesced as well. I stopped and waited for Doodle. The sound of rain was everywhere, but the wind had died and it fell straight down in parallel paths like ropes hanging from the sky. As I waited, I peered through the downpour, but no one came. Finally, I went back and found him huddled beneath a red nightshade bush beside the road. He was sitting on the ground, his face buried in his arms, which were resting on his drawn-up knees. "Let's go, Doodle," I said. He didn't answer, so I placed my hand on his forehead and lifted his head. Limply, he fell backward onto the earth. He had been bleeding from the mouth, and his neck and the front of his shirt were stained a brilliant red. "Doodle! Doodle!" I cried, shaking him, but there was no answer but the ropey rain. He lay very awkwardly, with his head thrown far back, making his vermilion neck appear unusually long and slim. His little legs, bent sharply at the knees, had never before seemed so fragile, so thin. I began to weep, and the tear-blurred vision in red before me looked very familiar. "Doodle!" I screamed above the pounding storm and threw my body to the earth above his. For a long, long time, it seemed forever, I lay there crying, sheltering my fallen Scarlet Ibis from the heresy of rain.
Well, boys and girls, this story, just the way the author, James Hurst, gives us so many wonderful details. You know, when he's crying out Doodle, the only answer is the ropey rain. There's so many great descriptions on things here, and he really contemplates a real moral internal conflict that most brothers and sisters and siblings have. And you know, we push each other. Sometimes we push each other hard, and we will make mistakes in our lives. And you just think about this character and just how bad he has to feel. I want to take a look back at the moment when he's actually teaching Doodle to walk, you know, and his parents say to him, "Why are you crying?" And the narrator basically says that, you know, he doesn't really admit it to them, but he knew he's crying because he taught him to walk because of his own pride. He was ashamed of having a brother that was a cripple, and that pride pushed him to teach his brother to walk, to swim, to try to be as normal as possible. And inevitably that became the downfall for our narrator. But I want you to contemplate something. If the narrator had never pushed his brother so hard, if he hadn't pushed him the whole time, would Doodle have had the life he had? We think about the way that he was born and the parents continued to doubt his walking, his his being all there. And I think that it's because his brother pushed him so hard that he had those abilities, those shining moments, those great times at Old Woman Swamp. And it may seem petty and it may seem childish to you or girly, and I know that most kids, freshman boys, when they're reading, he said he would marry mommy and I could marry daddy. But you know what, as an older brother, 6 years older, all he did was listen to him and just go, yeah, because his stories were so good. And yeah, that might be childish, but at some point you just got to let down your guard, boys and girls. Let down your guard and say to yourself, I remember when I played like that. I remember when I was little like that. And it really is awesome the way that stories and literature can make us do that, can make me say, yeah, I once dreamt of marrying mommy, and it's kind of funny, but my daughters today, my little Ella, is often said before that, I'll marry daddy, and it's just really heartwarming, and I think one day you'll see that, and the way literature can make us think back is really powerful. Now, a couple of things that I do want to point out just before we end the video. We will talk about this more. We'll wrap up this story with a short story summary next time. But a couple things I do want to point out that I want you to be ready for class tomorrow is basically the author's writing in here. A couple of things I want to point out is that real conflict that the narrator has. The narrator is trying to basically explain why he's doing things, and really, I said before, pride is driving him to do these things, and we question, is pride a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Well, take a look at the way the narrator describes it right here. He goes, when he's first trying to teach him to walk, he falls over in the swamp, and he says, I can't do it, brother. He goes, shut up, you can, right? And we question, do we talk like this to our brother and sister? We're almost repulsed. It's almost repulsive the way that he will he'll talk to his brother, but yet haven't you spoken to your sibling like this? Haven't you treated your sibling like this? And would you treat your sibling like this? And he does cry when he realizes his pride made him walk, but I love the way he describes pride here. Take a look at the author's writing in here. It's just awesome. Oh, yes, you can, Doodle. All you got to do is try. Now, come on. And I held him up once more. It seemed so hopeless from the beginning that it's a miracle I didn't give up. But all of us must have something or someone to be proud of, and Doodle had become mine. I did not know then that pride is a wonderful, terrible thing, a seed that bears two vines, life and death. And I just want to think about that description of pride, an inanimate object that he relates to, metaphorically saying it's a seed that can bear two vines, life and death. And how did it for him? It was a seed that was inside of him that made him do things, and he had two vines growing here that he had to be very careful with. One vine is life and one vine is death. And pride can push you to do things, but pride is also looked upon by the Greeks as a terrible thing. We frown upon pride as Greeks are concerned. We don't like people who have their nose in the air, right? So we want people to be proud of themselves, and we want people to have self-esteem, and we try to give this to our kids, but this is a fine line, a balance that you have to walk in life. And this is a really great moral of this story. This narrator is trying to find the fine line, and he knows pride is a seed. It has a lot of evil and a lot of good, right? Without pride, we'll never have, you'll never be proud of yourself. You'll never be a person who, can public speak, who can just, do things, get out and do things. Pride instills that in you, but yet we don't want to be arrogant. We don't want to have our nose in the air, and we don't want to push people too far and have terrible tragedies like this happen. And that's the fine line of the story. I just really like that a lot. One more thing I do want to point out too, who are our main characters in the story? This is something we're going to review. We always talk about our characters. Who are the characters? We got William Armstrong, otherwise known as Doodle. We got Aunt Nicey, the voice of religion throughout this whole thing, and Mama and Daddy. What's our narrator's name? Narrator. If that makes you wonder or question, good. I question to myself, is this the author speaking? Did the author end up killing his brother? Did James Hurst go through this? I don't know. Is it a fictional character? But no matter what, this person is bearing all of his, wrongdoings. He's opening up and telling us that he thought of killing his brother, that he actually was the cause of his brother's death. Does the narrator go and tell his parents what happened here? Or does he just say he had blood on him and he tripped and died? And who knows? Maybe he's got this guilt in him, still in him this whole time. And if you're full of guilt and you're writing a story like this, do you tell people your name? I think the fact that he only uses the name narrator is hiding something. He doesn't want to maybe admit who he really is. He's admitting all the things he's done. He's getting those off his chest, but does he admit who he is? Who is this narrator? We don't know. That's beautiful in itself. What an epiphany for Hurst to write something like that. The narrator. And it's awesome. We got this one guy with two names, Doodle, William Armstrong, and then he doesn't even tell us the name of the narrator. It's on purpose, guys. When you question things like that, good. You should question that. Okay? A couple more things I wanted to talk about. I love the resurrection in here. When he talks about, and they show them that he's going to be walking, right? Doodle's 6th birthday for weeks. We had moon around the house promising everybody a most spectacular surprise. Aunt Nicey said after so much talk, if we produced anything less tremendous than the resurrection, she was going to be disappointed. What resurrection are we talking about? It's capitalized. We're talking about Christ, okay? And she goes, and remember, she's the voice of religion throughout this story. She says he was born in Jesus' cloth, right? And Jesus' nightgown, the shawl. So this resurrection, she goes, if it's anything less than the resurrection, I'm going to be disappointed. Was Aunt Nicey disappointed? No, everybody was thrilled. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. And it's kind of funny, but you think about the resurrection, the rising of Christ. Doodle rises out of the chair, right? They all think this was a miracle, the resurrection, a miracle. This is just such a great comparison using the resurrection here. And so I love that literature, that part of the literature, the text here. And we know our narrator starts crying there. Now, I'm not going to scroll down to find it. If you do have your textbook, I wanted to just point out a couple more things. But the connection between Doodle and the Scarlet Ibis, right? Everybody else kind of leaves it alone. Doodle won't let it go without burying it. We can see how connected he was, and we know by the end of the story how that symbolically represented him. A bird that's out of place, that's gangly and sickly, that ends up dying, and the redness. And people always ask me, Mr. Gillo, how does he die? What happened? Doodle is running in this storm, trying to, guys, when you are really playing great sports, and I'm out on the ice and I'm playing hockey, and I'm really sweating and breathing hard, I can taste blood. Can you taste that in there? It's like, your whole body is a system, and we don't know. Doodle's been crippled, and as he's throwing his heart and soul into this and running, trying to catch his brother who won't wait up for him in the rain, he starts to cough and choke, and he's spitting up blood. And I think that he ends up drowning in his own blood. And we get the redness, the red on his shirt, his white t-shirt, the red of the Scarlet Ibis coming out, and his neck just like that Scarlet Ibis when he died. We saw the connection between Doodle and the Ibis earlier, and the symbolism is so there. And one last thing I do want to point out is that bleeding tree, right? That Scarlet Ibis lands in that tree, and that's where it dies, right under that bleeding tree. At the end, if Doodle is the Scarlet Ibis, if Doodle is the Ibis, which is obvious, what's the narrator? I'm going to scroll right to the very end of the story here, right to the very end of the story, and I want you to take a look at this. I began to weep at the tear-blurred version in red before me looked very familiar. Doodle, I screamed, above the pounding storm and threw my body to the earth above his. Kind of like he's protecting. For a long time, I seemed forever, I lay there crying, sheltering my fallen Scarlet Ibis. If Doodle's the Scarlet Ibis, the brother is the bleeding tree. Right? And I told you, don't think of things literally. It's not the sap running from the tree. And when it's blood, it's not blood. Who's actually bleeding here? Literally Doodle. But the brother is the bleeding tree that's protecting him. He's bleeding here inside, right? And all of a sudden, this symbolism rushes out, and this story is beautiful. But I'm telling you one thing. I've read this story 50, 60 times now in my life. And every time I read it, the narrator, I read this, some other line that the author puts in here, descriptions of the flowers and the smells, and this is one of my favorite short stories ever, and I hope you appreciate it as well. Okay, so be thinking of those literary terms that I've been talking about, the foreshadowing, the color, imagery, and the symbolism, indeed symbolism, the one biggest literary term that we'll be talking about with this story. Hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching. This is video 8.